Hello, everybody. If you can hear us, my name's Mike Morgan. I'm from Hamilton Fraser, and I'm a legal beagle who works with the mediation service and also HF Assist, which is a letting agent helpline. And I'm joined by Vanessa Warwick. Vanessa's a property guru, but tell us a little bit more about your background and yourself.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a property guru. I'm a landlord. I've been investing in property since 2004, so 18 odd years now. And I also co-founded Property Tribes, which is one of the leading landlord and property investor communities in the UK. I do some consultancy work and I do a lot of commentary for the mainstream media, such as The Guardian, Times, Sunday Times, the States Gazette, and so on. So I'm very, very immersed in the sector. And because I'm managing a really large community of property investors, I've got kind of insights into what causes landlord pain and what the issues that landlords are facing. And as we're going to discuss, there are many challenges for landlords at the moment. I've been in property for 18 years now.
Good. Well, I think what we wanted to talk about today was this issue about how we communicate with tenants, and I guess we're all thinking that the last year or 18 months has been very different with the pandemic and all of the changes that that's brought to tenancies and relationships. So what would we think the single biggest thing we've learned from that would be then, Vanessa?
I think that COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns have really brought into sharp focus the importance of good landlord and tenant relationships. Now, to my mind, they've always been important, but never more so than during the absolutely unique situation that landlords and indeed tenants have found themselves in over the past year or so. So I think from what I can see from Property Tribes, and I'm active on a lot of other forums and communities and groups, it seems that, and it's not surprising, that the landlords who had good relationships with their tenants, who had nurtured those relationships with their tenants, they have fared a lot better than the landlords who didn't. And if you're working obviously with a letting agent, you want the agent to represent you to your tenant in the manner that you would directly yourself. So very important again for tenant relationships, if you are using a fully managed service, is to be happy with the communication via the agent as well. But very, very definitely landlord-tenant relationships have really come to the fore. And I think that's actually one of the positive things that has come out of all of this, that landlords and tenants have worked together to try and get through. And we're in unprecedented times. Nobody has been through this before, certainly not in my lifetime, or anything like it. And the people that have worked together, tried to maintain tenancies, tried to find solutions if a tenant is struggling, they're the landlords that will have survived and be able to move forward from this.
Yeah, no, I would agree entirely with what you're saying, and I think for me, one of the biggest observations that I've made is that landlords and tenants are in it together, and I think it's been really gratifying in a lot of the cases that we've seen, that the landlords and the tenants who realise they've got to help each other out to get through problems are the ones that, as you say, fare the best and get through those difficulties more sensibly. So what is then? Obviously, this is a slightly different set of circumstances with the pandemic. We've had lots of cases come across our desk here where tenants are being less willing to agree to things like contractors visiting the property. What sort of tips do we think that we'd have for those scenarios?
Well, again, if you've got a good relationship with your tenant and you have open lines of communication, these issues are going to be far less than if you don't. Um, you know, I really wanted to just continue a bit on with what you were saying before, Mike, about landlords and tenants being in this together. I personally have always railed against this kind of them and us, which the media try to, you know, weave a narrative around that, you know, it's very much them and us. It's not. We are providing a service for our tenants, and, you know, we want to help them if they get into trouble in these very, very unprecedented circumstances. Well, I know I certainly did when I had a tenant who started to struggle. So, you know, I just think it's a case of really highlighting the lines of communication, keeping them open. And I've always believed in, you know, communicating with people in their preferred manner. Now, some people like to receive a phone call, some people like to get a text, some people prefer email, some tenants like to chat on WhatsApp. And I think when you start out with a new tenant, I think one of the first things you should do when you're setting up the tenancy is inquire how they like to be communicated with. I think that's a respectful thing to do. And, you know, just speaking for myself, I much prefer email than getting a text. But having said that, if you look at text open rates, for instance, they're somewhere in the region of 97%. So a text can very often nudge a tenant to communicate if all other avenues have failed. So I think, you know, it's really just understanding what the tenant's position is in an emergency. Maybe they're shielding, maybe they're self-isolating, and obviously just trying to allay their fears that a contractor can make a COVID safe visit. Perhaps you could ask the tenant to go out for a walk when the contractor is due to arrive, or after they've arrived. And, you know, just really reassure them that, you know, the contractors are going to operate in a COVID safe manner. And indeed, you know, I've just had a smart meter fitted this morning, and the contractor came in a mask. He was very respectful of social distancing. He wiped down all the surfaces, door handles that he touched with, you know, antiseptic wipes. He had hand sanitizer. So, you know, all of these things can help encourage tenants if they need a visit. But in some circumstances, there are legitimate reasons why they wouldn't. And I think you've just got to work with that as best you can.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely right and really, really good advice. I mean, somebody said to me the other day that whilst a tenancy might not be a marriage made in heaven, it's certainly a partnership, and I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. Sometimes you've got to work together through the along the way. But I agree with you. I think, you know, getting to know your tenants is important. Getting to understand a bit more about, you know, what makes them tick, what's going on in their lives. I think, interestingly, we talk about social distancing with coronavirus, but again, what we've seen with the landlords who do, you know, make the effort to communicate with their tenants and also be proactive. Don't necessarily wait for them to come to you with a problem. Maybe get in touch with them from time to time just to see how they are, how things are going, whether there's any problems. Actually, it sort of works the other way. We might be socially distanced because of the virus, but we can break that down and overcome it. And I see some very good landlords who will just sort of check in with their tenants, you know, say they necessarily become friends, but they become, you know, friendly in the course of the tenancy. So I think that's all really, really good groundwork. we talked about this the other day when we were mentioning prevention being better than cure, didn't we? So, for instance, a case that we've got on the go at the moment, where there's a leak from under a bath in a tenancy property. Actually, it worked quite well to the landlord's advantage. They reached out to the tenant, just had a chat to see how things were going, whether there was any problems. And the tenant mentioned about this leak under the bath, but started their conversation with, I wasn't going to mention it because I didn't want to make a fuss, but so actually it made what could have been a bigger problem if it was left unaddressed, actually, nicely solved at the beginning rather than
that's a good example, Mike, and definitely 100% that prevention in property is always less costly, less stressful, less heartache than cure. And everything actually that we try and do at Property Tribes is to encourage landlords to be in prevention mode for those reasons, because if something goes wrong, it can escalate. It can cost a lot more than if you were able to really prevent it going wrong in the first place. So yes, it's really important, I think, for landlords to operate in prevention mode rather than waiting for something to go wrong. And it was a perfect example you gave there of a tenant that there was a leak with the bath. A lot of tenants, sometimes they don't want to report minor repairs because they don't want to bother the landlord, or they're worried that they're going to rock the boat in some way. Of course, if you had a good relationship with your tenant, they wouldn't feel like that. But if you don't have a particularly close relationship with your tenants, then those are the kind of things that they might feel. And it's really in your interest as a landlord that they do communicate any repairs or maintenance that need doing sooner rather than later, because as we're saying, some of these things can actually escalate and get a lot worse and start to cost a lot more money. So I think making sure that the tenant knows that your door is open to report repairs and maintenance issues, and I think that kind of ties in nicely as well with something that I'm a big advocate of, and that is midterm property inspections. Obviously, during COVID, it's been harder to undertake these, and we're actually now seeing a lot of fallout of issues that have arisen during COVID and that weren't able to be detected because of it. And now these issues are starting to come out of the woodwork, such as the tenant has suddenly acquired an unauthorized pet, or the tenant is suffering with mental health issues and has become a hoarder. These kind of things, if you were undertaking midterm property inspections, you would be able to pick them up and nip them in the bud. And if the tenant needed help in any area, you could work with them on that. So again, I think if you've got this good relationship with your tenant, they understand that the midterm property inspection is for their benefit as well, because you want to check for maintenance and repair issues. Again, this is kind of heading these kind of issues off at the pass and making sure that they don't happen. And being in prevention mode, I think, is what an informed and educated landlord would want to be. They'd want to be proactive and make sure that they're across their entire portfolio, and that they are able to attend to these issues as and when they arise. But again, everything in any business, whether you're anything to do with business, it is all actually about good communication, and being a property investor or landlord is absolutely no different. You have clients who are your tenants, and the better communication you have with them, the more open communication, then the better that relationship is going to be, and the tenancy is going to be stronger as a result. And I know, Mike, you'll be able to concur with me that landlords and tenants that do have good relationships, the tenants tends to stay in the property longer because they like the relationship, and you know, that they're happy in their home and they feel that they're valued, and that you know, the landlord cares about them having a good experience in the property. So you know, there's so much to be said for this personal kind of approach to it, and even more so we're seeing the advent of build to rent, which is a you know, essentially a corporate landlord. I think that the private sector landlord, the small landlord, actually now has an advantage because they are a genuine person that they can be contacted. They're not a faceless corporation, and I would imagine that, you know, tenants who were struggling with payments during COVID, if they went to a big corporate landlord, I'm not sure that a big, you know, corporate landlord would be as empathetic or as accommodating as perhaps a smaller landlord. And you know, I've heard stories of tenants that say, actually, I want to rent from a small private landlord because I want to, you know my landlord and know the person at the end of the phone. So, you know, I think it's a big advantage to small landlords if they can offer this, you know, this personal kind of service where they try and understand the tenant's position and can be empathetic to their situation and can try and help the tenant through if they're struggling in some way.
Yeah. Again, I think that's really, really good, strong points to bear in mind. I think the other thing that was interesting about this case that we touched on with our leaky bath, what I particularly liked about this landlord was that they were obviously very open and approachable by phone. But what they also did was that each time they had a sort of meaningful conversation, not every single conversation, but each time they had something significant to discuss or agree, then they would send an email afterwards. So I thought that was really good because, you know, along the lines of, we spoke today, you told me there was a leak with the bath, just to confirm what I'm doing is, you know, it goes a long way to just reinforcing that support that you're offering for the tenant. But it's also, I think, about just reassurance that something is happening, and that can obviously stop tenants worrying or escalating issues later on. It's also important, I think, because, you know, we're saying, how do we communicate during the here and now? But we've also got to think about the future, haven't we? What happens if things go wrong? What happens if there's an argument or a dispute later? So I think it's important, whenever we're talking about communicating, to also just remember it's about confirming, you know, reinforcing things with the tenant and making sure you've got that audit trail along the way, because that's always useful to have, just in case it's needed again.
An audit trail very important. You know, should there be a dispute somewhere later down the line, if you've got things in writing, you can revert back to those, and, you know, say, well, actually, this is what happened, and here's the email trail to prove it. So I think that's very good practice, Mike. And as you say, it's reassuring the tenant that they've understood the outcome of the conversation. They know what the next steps are going to be. They know if they need to take any action in any particular instance, such as to be in, well, everybody's in at the moment, but when people are out at work, sometimes they have to take a couple of hours off work to let a contractor in, for instance. You know, this helps, as you say, smooth that process, definitely.
Yeah. So just moving on a little bit from there then, obviously I think rent arrears has been the biggest problem we've seen during lockdown, during the pandemic, and we've seen cases where it can be very small or comparatively small amounts of rent arrears, you know, maybe half a month or a month, and we've seen other cases where, you know, it's been over £80,000 of rent arrears that's built up over a long period of time. So I think with all of those situations, talking sooner rather than later is important, isn't it? And I think as we've just said, sometimes prompting that conversation or encouraging it is something that landlords need to think about as well. One of the
Yeah.
cases, one of the cases that we dealt with recently, which again I thought was good, was one where a tenant went to the landlord before they got into difficulty with their rent. They could see on the horizon that there might be a problem because they were going to be furloughed. They had some obviously uncertainty about where that left them, how long that would continue. And so this tenant was contacting the landlord to say, Houston, we may have a problem. And that worked really well because then landlord and tenant were able to start thinking ahead, how can we get through this? What sorts of things might we think about doing to help each other out? Rather than, waiting for that and the sort of angry phone call or the angry knock on the door. It was a much more constructive way of approaching it.
Yeah, well, Mike, I would say if there is a late rent payment, you shouldn't ever jump in with your size 10s and get angry or aggressive
Yeah.
towards the tenant, because sometimes there can be very legitimate reasons why a rent payment is late. So in any business relationship, the first thing you should do is sound out the other party if you're fearful that there might be a problem. So if a rent payment didn't turn up, that would be a case of contacting the tenant by their preferred method of communication and saying, oh, sorry to disturb you, but I've just noticed the rent hasn't turned up for this month. Is there a problem? Do you need help with anything? And make sure that they feel they can come to you. As I say, there might be an entirely legitimate reason. I've heard of, bank mistakes, bank errors, things like that. So maybe, there could be any other legitimate reason. So the main thing is to first establish if there is a cause for concern, or if the tenant's going to come back to you and say, oops, sorry about that, I had this problem, I'll be making the payment on Friday, so keep an eye out for it. So that would be the first thing to do. Never ever enter into any kind of situation like that with hostility or aggression, because you're just going to alienate the person. And I know, Mike, you'll agree with me that if a tenant shuts down communication with you, that is a very bad sign, and things are not going to get better from that. So as long as a tenant is communicating with me, keeping me informed of what's happening, I'm okay with that. It's when they actually start blocking me or blanking me, that's when I start to feel that there's some concern, some reason for concern. But yeah, the main thing is, as we've said all along, if there is a healthy relationship between the landlord and tenant, the tenant will maybe preempt it and come to the landlord, or the landlord can contact the tenant and say, what's your situation now that we've gone into lockdown? Are you on furlough? Are you able to work from home? Do you need help to claim housing benefit? And just explore the tenant situation and understand it. And I had one tenant who was struggling in the early part of the first lockdown, and we agreed that they would pay 50% rent for 2 months. And they felt that after that period, they would be able to get back on their feet and stable financially. And then we agreed that after the 2 months, they would just make an extra top-up payment on the rent to repay the arrears. And to their credit, they did exactly that, and they stuck to it. And there wasn't a further issue with them with subsequent lockdowns. So, working together, trying to find solutions, and being empathetic, I think, because a lot of people have really struggled with their mental well-being through lockdown. Landlords are no different. We struggle with things that have happened to us during lockdown. We all know people that have died or of COVID, or we know friends of friends who have died of COVID. It has impacted everybody. And being stuck in your home for a year, and some people have been extremely isolated, had very little human contact. it's very challenging times for people, and we should all be empathetic towards that. And you know, if somebody is struggling, we should try and see what we can do to help them. And you know, there's been some fantastic stories of landlords that have done really kind and compassionate things for their tenants during this lockdown. But of course, you won't hear about those. You'll only hear about my greedy landlord did this, or my landlord kicked me out and changed the locks and made me homeless. So, you know, we hear this anti-landlord rhetoric in the media all the time. And, you know, to be truthful, a story saying, oh, my landlord gave me 2 months free rent during the pandemic, it's not really of interest to the papers, because it's not going to grab those eyeballs.
That's right, sadly.
For. So landlords can only do their bit.
I think that's. Sorry, I was going to say, I think that's a good point, actually, and I think it just brings us back to what we've said about cultivating that positive relationship from the get-go, because already, you know, a landlord is showing to a tenant, you know, I'm a good landlord. There are landlords like me out there, and you know, this is a better way of conducting our relationship during the course of the tenancy. So I think there's another top tip for the listeners to take away from what we were just discussing, which is, you know, when there's a problem, do a fact find, understand what's happening, understand why it's happening, and also, you know, obviously a landlord will have their own views on what they want to see happen, but I think it's also worth asking the question of the tenant, what would you like to see happen? Because it's surprising, actually, in some of the disputes that we see, that landlords sometimes think tenants are going to want to move heaven and earth to solve a problem and ask for an awful lot of things to be done, when in fact, in a lot of cases, tenants aren't asking for that, and asking them the question, you know, what would fix it, I think is really valuable to start to understand more about their needs, not just what you think their needs might be.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I think another top tip, Mike, would well, actually, I've got two. First of all, to seek a homeowning guarantor for a tenant, because that obviously is a line of communication and redress if the tenant stops paying the rent. And the other thing that I do is I ask for a next of kin phone number for the tenant. And the reason that I do this is because many years ago, when I first started out as a landlord, I had a tenant in an HMO who had been abroad, and he came back and he went into a coma. And we had to call an ambulance for him, but we did not have any contact details for his family, and it turned out he'd been bitten by a poisonous spider while he was abroad, and he'd had a terrible reaction to it. So again, you know, if you had concerns over your tenant's mental well-being during lockdown, if you had their next of kin, you could perhaps ring them and say, you know, just want to talk to you just quietly about something I'm a little concerned about. I can't get hold of your tenant, or their behavior, sorry, I can't get hold of my tenant, or their behavior has changed and I'm a little bit concerned about them. So, you know, there are other lines of communication, you know, to have, not just with the tenant, perhaps with a family member, as I said, or a guarantor.
Again, it's a really good idea. So just thinking about where things then do go wrong. So say we've got this Say we've got the situation, this situation where a tenant is in arrears, and maybe they've, you know, stuck their head in the sand a bit. They've stopped communicating. It's a difficult situation, isn't it, when you've tried everything you can do to get a response from them, and you're not getting it. Obviously, we can't force people to respond or communicate. What would your top tip be in those circumstances, Vanessa?
It's so challenging at the moment because obviously we've had the eviction ban anyway. So a very small minority of tenants have seem to take advantage of that and think, oh, well, I just won't pay the rent. I can't be evicted. And I think, to be honest, the government is partly to blame as well, because in the early stages of the pandemic, when they started letting us know about the various different support measures, one of the things they talked about was landlords having a payment holiday. Now, that is completely erroneous terminology. It wasn't a payment holiday, it was a deferment of a payment. So the landlord would still have to make that payment later down the line. But there was quite a lot of stuff on social media and in Facebook groups about tenants saying, oh, landlords are having payment holidays, they're not paying their mortgages, so let's not pay our rent. And again, I have to stress this was only the minority. But, these kind of situations, the pandemic, and I've said this right from day one, it's brought out the best in people and the worst in people. So we've seen some people do amazing things and try to be caring and of service to other people, and then we've seen others who have taken complete advantage of the situation and it's worth with no disregard, with no regard for anybody else or their feelings. So it's very, very challenging when the tenant shuts down communication. It's hard to say, to know what to do. One of the things you could do if you had a guarantor or a next of kin, you could possibly ring them and contact them and say the tenant is putting their tenancy in jeopardy. Are you able to speak to them and ask them to get in touch with me? I'm not going to bite their head off. I just want to talk to them and see if I can help them. Failing that, you could give them a couple of days notice that you were going to call by the property and see if you could talk to them just on the doorstep. Again, reassuring them that you just want to try and understand what the issue is, how they can perhaps get some help. Other than that, it's hard to know what to do. I don't know if you've got any suggestions.
Well, I'm going to make a suggestion in a moment, but I agree with what you're saying. Exhaust all means available to communicate with the tenant or somebody else on their behalf, as you say, next of kin or guarantor. So, I've got more than one channel of communication. Let's try and use it. I think from my experience, though, I think sometimes what's forgotten is that who else could speak with this tenant for me? If I'm a landlord and they're not speaking to me, would they speak with somebody else? And that's where mediation and the mediation service that we offer has really come to the fore, particularly during lockdown, because we found there's an awful lot of cases where tenants are at their wits' end, for example, with rent arrears, and they're terrified of losing their home. They can't see light at the end of the tunnel in terms of money, and often the reaction is to just ignore it, put your head down, and just not talk to people. So using a mediation service has shown that tenants will often open up and speak to that mediator, because they're an independent third party. They're not the person that they've got the issue with. And once I think, we're able to explain to tenants that we're here as a mediator to try and represent both parties, if you like, act in both parties' best interests, tenants will often open up and start to talk about it. So I think that's a really good thing for landlords to bear in mind. If you've reached that impasse where you're not getting any further, or if you've reached that sort of roadblock where you just can't get any more responses from people, I think using mediation is really important to think about.
Yes, I think, Mike, I would concur on that, because I think it strips out a lot of the emotion And that's where the problems occur, when people get very, very emotional, very het up. The landlord might be struggling financially themselves. They might have a relative who's ill with COVID. They might be dealing with other challenges in their life. And then you've got the tenant who is possibly in similar predicament, who feels very uncertain about the future, very frightened, very worried. And you get this huge build up of emotion from both parties, and it can lead to actually a lot of resentment. And I think having that impartial person in the middle who is not invested in the relationship in any way, they're totally independent, they can see both sides of the story. I think that's a really, really positive thing. And I would say that's another positive thing that has come out of the pandemic and the fallout from lockdowns, is that mediation has become much more to the fore when these kind of issues occur. And I think that's going to be the direction of travel moving forwards, particularly because we've got massive court backlogs that are going to take maybe years to clear. I think there's going to be this extra step before you go to court proceedings, whereby you try and have some kind of mediation. And I think that from what I'm hearing from certain quarters, that this is something that the government is interested in pursuing further as we unravel out of lockdown. But I was wondering, Mike, if you had any kind of case studies you could share with us about when a mediator was brought in and how it worked.
So a couple of thoughts about that. I think just before I do that, just touching on the courts and the government's view, they have introduced this requirement for mediation in housing possession cases, and the court can refer a case to a mediator, and it's in the last sort of 28 days before a hearing. But of course, that's right at the end of a very long journey, and I think what we're really saying in this webinar is, don't let it get to that point. Talk about it sooner rather than later. It's much easier to solve things if you talk about them at the early stages, rather than it becoming a bigger and more entrenched problem. So just to give you a bit of a problem and a case study about mediation, one of my favourite cases that we've seen was a tenant who had rent arrears during lockdown, where furlough had caused them problems. They'd been a good tenant throughout their tenancy without any rent arrears or problems. And they, as I say, got into a pickle with lockdown. The landlord was saying that they were happy for the tenant to pay their arrears in instalments, so pay their normal monthly rent plus a small amount each month to clear down the arrears. But the time scale that the landlord wanted that to be done in, the number of months, meant that it was too tight for the tenant. The monthly instalment was too much. So what we did in that case, we were able to sort of think outside the box a bit with the tenant and try and understand whether there was another way for them to be able to finance those arrears. And cut a long story short, they were able to find a loan which gave them the money in a lump sum, and the repayments that they then had to make on that were over more months and at a more affordable monthly rate than what the landlord was offering, and the tenant was happy to do that. It also transpired that this particular tenant had a child with special needs who was in a particular school, and they didn't want to have upheaval in that child's sort of life over the next year or so. So what the mediator proposed to the landlord was, if this tenant is able to give you the money in one sum and clear the arrears, would you be able to give them another fixed term tenancy so that they've got that peace of mind about remaining in the property for at least another year because of those personal circumstances. And both sides were happy. Landlord's got his money in full, tenant's got the sort of financial flexibility to get through that bump in the road, and also got that peace of mind around their their security. So that was a good example, a little bit of kind of creative thinking. What's a way through this problem?
Yeah. Well, I've got a favourite. Sorry, Mike. I was just going to say I've got a favourite saying. It is imagined. Real problems can always be solved. It's only imagined ones that seem insurmountable. So these are real problems, and there will be a solution to them for sure.
Yeah,
and that's given a good example.
That's right. One other case we had recently actually was also about antisocial behaviour, and it was with a tenant in an HMO who was a goth and didn't talk to anybody, very quiet, very insular, and used to just go in their property at the end of the day, and obviously during lockdown not leave it, and play very loud thrash metal music, which obviously got on everybody else's nerves, and wouldn't speak to anyone about it, wouldn't communicate. If they knocked on the door, he just slammed the door. And through mediation, again, we were able to talk to that tenant, understand what was going on. Turns out they had some difficult personal circumstances in their personal life, which they were working through, and loud music was one of the ways they coped with it.
So maybe a set of headphones.
Well, yeah, well, that's it. I mean, the things we spoke to them about was, could you wear headphones? Could you do it differently? Actually, in the end, they realised that for them, living in a house on top of other people didn't actually help. It wasn't best for them, and so that particular tenant agreed to move. The landlord very reasonably made a sort of financial gesture towards helping them do that, and again, a win-win for everybody. So yeah, I do think it's interesting actually in mediation that you'll often find people are more willing to solve problems than they think, or we might think. And actually the success rate that we see in mediation, not just in our scheme, but typically it can be as high as 70% of cases get solved. Now, there may be some element of compromise in some of those cases, but the point is the problem goes away. It's solved in a way that both parties are happy with. So I think that's another thing I think it's worth bearing in mind with mediation, is it's about finding a solution that we can both agree on. It's not an imposed solution. It's not somebody telling you what to do. And I think that's the bit that really helps, particularly with people who are either anxious about trusting somebody, or who feel dictated to, or who feel that there isn't a way through the problem. So yeah. And I think the title of our talk today, How to Calmly Communicate, actually, sometimes the best way to calmly communicate may be through somebody else. And I just had a landlord today who was saying, I've tried everything. I've, just got to the point where I'm at my wit's end and I just can't talk to this person anymore. They're driving me mad. What do I do? And that's a really good example of a case where mediation can help. In fact, we spoke to the tenant this morning. The tenant was, very happy to mediate, and we'll see what happens. But so far, they're both talking again, albeit through that third party. So I think, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's just really good to hear stories like that, because at the end of the day, nobody wants conflict. We've all got enough things on our plate to deal with, and when you've got an issue like this in the background, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, it is emotionally draining. It causes stress, and you should explore every avenue to solve it as soon as possible, and be able to just get that stressful thing off your plate. So I think it's really good that there's a mediation service out there for landlords and tenants, and I hope that more landlords start to consider it if they are, if that communication does break down for whatever reason, or if maybe it was never there in the first place, as we said. So, but I think definitely going forward, there are lessons to be learned from what happened during COVID-19, and I think one of the top lessons is to maintain those harmonious and respectful relationships with your tenants, and have those lines of communication set up and open. And that will help landlords going forwards. And you know, as also I would say, think also about really robust tenant referencing, particularly when there's uncertainty, economic uncertainty going forwards as well. So think about how you're going to reference tenants going forward. Make sure your processes and your protocols are really, really robust, because the best way to never experience a bad tenant is to never let to one in the first place. So there's lots of new digital tools out there, like open banking, that you can access, where you can get a proper snapshot of a tenant's financial position, and so on and so forth. So do take advantage of the services out there that allow you to make those kind of references. I think we're nearly up to time, aren't we?
Yeah, I think we're just about run out of time now. So thank you, Vanessa. That's been really good talking to you, and I hope that the listeners have got some top tips and some food for thought to think about as they work their way through their tenancies. So we'll say goodbye to the listeners then. I'll say goodbye to you, Vanessa, and everybody take care and keep safe.
Right. Yes, indeed. Thank you to everybody for watching, and thank you to you, Mike, for hosting this. And hope to see some people over on propertytribes.com.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Cheerio. Bye. Bye.